On the day this episode releases, 11th of July 2025, all going well, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 releases today and is out now for Nintendo Switch 2. A friend of mine had an early copy but lent it to me for the purpose of this review, so I have played this and quite extensively over the last few days. And despite really looking forward to it, I've actually decided not to buy my own copy, for reasons that I'll get into. It's not a bad game, depending on what you want from it. In fact, it's a good game, just one that I, as a fan of the series, am very disappointed by, although your mileage or footage may vary. And we'll get into exactly why after I read the short podcast intro. Hi everyone, welcome to Daily Switch 2, a podcast covering everything related to the Nintendo Switch 2 with at least one new episode or video uploaded per day to YouTube, Spotify and your favorite major platforms. My name is Sam and I've been a gamer since the 1980s. I've worked in the entertainment industry since I was a teenager, including as a games journalist, producer of gaming documentaries and shows, and I'm even programming multiple indie video games, including 4, which will be released on the Switch and hopefully Switch 2, so be sure to subscribe and follow the show for the world-exclusive news on those as they drop. However, I'm a gamer and Nintendo fan at heart, and this podcast is purely a passion project for me to talk about the stuff that interests and excites me about this new system. It's not monetized or funded by any entity. It's completely unofficial and unbiased so that I can give my full, frank, honest opinions. So if you want to support me or just find out the best places to get these free daily episodes or to join our free members area where you can talk to me and leave suggestions and take part in monthly free giveaways to win official Nintendo prizes, all links are in the bio and at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. Thank you so much. And back to the episode. So, I've never been a huge sports game guy, save for the more arcade-style titles like NBA Jam, Neo Turf Masters, Windjammers, Worldwide Soccer 97, but I was a huge extreme sports guy, skateboarding, BMX, snowboarding. I've bought many of those titles and probably lost months of my life trying to perfect my best runs and combinations of tricks. In fact, my favorite game of all time is Nights into Dreams, which masquerades as a 3D platformer, but in actuality is more like a trick attack boarding game taken to its logical extremes in a dream world where real-world physics don't apply. Once you get good at them, any extreme sports game worth their salt becomes a sublime experience, and you feel like it's an art, putting together the best gymnastics routine, freestyle dance performance, or mastering a martial art. These games are literally made for replayability and mastery. Now, growing up in the 1980s, skateboarding was cool. I bought a yellow and black skateboard from Argos. I believe it was a Mad Skull or Lilo Yulo design with a skull with a knife through it. It was super cool. If anybody actually has one of those, or I'm also looking for a Veriflex Ramp Rat in good condition, I would love to buy either or both of them in good condition, so give me a shout. I never actually was much good at skateboarding. I'm somewhat maladroit, clumsy, but the Tony Hawk's games are really the games that make you feel like you know how to skateboard. My history with Tony Hawk's, I played the heck out of 1 and especially 2 on PSX PlayStation. I played a bit of 3 on the N64, which was a mistake. I should have stuck with the PlayStation versions, really. Sorry, Nintendo fans. But I played the heck out of 4 on GameCube, and I think that's where most Nintendo fans will know the series. There was also Underground, or Tony Hawk's Underground, or Thug for short, which was kind of cool. And I know it had at least 1 sequel, possibly 3, not sure, but I kind of fell off the series around that time. It seemed to be diminishing returns after that, and Pro Skater 5 was seemingly unanimously destroyed by reviewers and fans alike, so I didn't even bother to try that one out. It's worth mentioning the GBA games were surprisingly cool ports, or demakes, I suppose, with isometric viewpoint, pre-rendered backgrounds, but I think the sprites were actual 3D, not pre-rendered, not sure. But anyway, it was neat, and they played far better than they had any right to. The 2020 remake of 1 and 2 was not perfect in my eyes, but it was pretty well received overall. In fact, I believe it has the highest first month sales of any game in the entire franchise. And that is saying something, because in the 90s and 2000s, these were big games. So after such a huge financial success, developers' vicarious visions were, of course, rewarded by being completely shut down, losing their jobs following the Activision Blizzard merger. Fantastic. Yay, the modern gaming industry. It looked for a long while like 3 and 4 would never get a release, but 5 years later, here it is, the sequel helmed this time by Iron Galaxy instead of Vicarious Visions. The official blurb for this game on the website, eShops and Box Art says, and I quote, "Everything you loved is back, but revamped with more skaters, new parks, gnarlier tricks, eardrum-shattering music, plus a whole lot more." And that is a big fat lie. Or at least, in my opinion, it depends on how you look at it. But yeah. Frankly, if they would just release an upscaled 1-to-1 port of the first 4 games using the PS4 versions of 1 to 3 and whichever 128-bit in inverted commas system version of 4 works best, I would recommend it wholeheartedly. And even at a full price of $70 or even $80, if the whole thing was on the cart, I'd be happy to pay that. But that's not what is here. Obviously, the title is 3 plus 4, but it's not even 1-to-1 versions of those games. It's like the previous Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 plus 2 release. This is a remake. It's not just a remaster where it's the same games but looking a bit nicer and running better. No, these are remakes from the kinda ground up. And like last time, but especially with this version, there is a ton of content missing. If you grew up with Tony Hawk's 3 or 4 and you are hoping to replay those games in shiny HD, you may well be very disappointed, depending on what you are looking for and what it was about those games that you loved. So here's the good news. It plays really well. Genuinely plays great. If you just want to recreate that feeling of smooth controls, satisfying trick combos, and jamming out, sort of going into a state of flow while merging with the skate punk rock music, you'll probably have a good time. Likewise, if you've never played a Tony Hawk's game but have been interested in checking them out, you will have a good time here too. If you want a high-quality skateboarding game, this is a very, very decent experience, to say the least. I have heard some people mentioning the occasional performance hitch on Switch too, and even potential crashes, hard locks, or resets. But in my time playing, at least, I've experienced nothing of the sort. It was all very smooth, very polished. The Tony Hawk's games always played extremely well, and this is no exception. There is a very decent roster of skaters to choose from, including some kind of cool novelty ones, Ninja Turtles and the like. There's pros returning from the original games and the new peeps from the first remake. Bam Margera is here for some reason. The games aren't separated. Everything is merged together as if it's one game, and the controls and tricks, etc. are the same whether you're riding on skate parks and levels that originated with the third or fourth title. So, for example, the spine transfers that previously only existed in 4 can now be used in the areas from 3 as well. Of course, any currency that you earn while playing is therefore also universal, and your custom skater that you build will work across all content too, as you'd expect, as do stat points, upgrades, etc. There are some new levels which are original to this version, and they are, to their credit, really cool and nicely made. I love the abandoned water park, and the pinball table is a really neat idea. The majority of levels, majority in inverted commas, but we'll get to that, the majority of levels from the original games are here and present and correct, and most of them play just as well as they always did. Most of them, and this is where we start with the negative. Some levels are straight up missing. Even just going by my hazy memory and not directly checking, I noticed that Chicago and the Carnival are missing from 4's lineup. So much for everything you loved is back, in inverted commas. Also, some of the levels have changes that I don't really love. I'm British, probably obvious by my accent, and London is now set at night. And as someone who spent a large amount of my career in the film industry working in London, the city is at its best during the day. It's not a city that comes out at night like, for example, Vegas with all the lights and stuff. The change to nighttime actively makes it seem more dull and less visually interesting, with many of the cool details of the architecture and the statues, etc., now barely visible. Also, minor spoiler, my beloved Stompy the Elephant from the original London version is replaced by a dude in his underwear. What the hell? London hasn't devolved that much in recent years, has it? I don't know. Speaking of animals, the zoo level is now relegated to just a tournament level and is abandoned, so there are no animals or people in the zoo. It's all very empty and depressing, and again, they set it at night, so the fun, colourful setting of the original is completely lost. In fact, many of the levels from the fourth game have been simplified to some extent, perhaps all of them. Previously, the game was a generational leap forward, moving from the PS1 and N64 to the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, and the scope of the game naturally became bigger. This is why, to many people, it's the best in the series. But all of this ambition and semi-open world nature, it's been completely removed, or at least massively pared back, to make the levels feel and play more like levels from the first three games, and to make them work more naturally with the classic game's 2-minute timer. There's no more free riding around, no more having conversations with other skaters and people. Many of the objectives and the levels have been cut down or just removed completely. I really hate these changes, and what it amounts to is the game should not be considered a remake of Tony Hawk's 3 and 4, but instead it's a remake of 3 with some of the levels from 4 adapted and demade to work in 3's engine. How much this will bother you depends on whether 4 was your previous favourite game in the series, or if you preferred the simpler, tighter format of 1 to 3. I have a strong feeling that for Nintendo fans specifically, they're going to have more nostalgia for 4 on the GameCube, because the N64 versions of 1 to 3 were always necessarily cut down because of the limitations of the cartridge. So while people who grew up with PlayStation, where the first 3 games were more popular, you might not even notice, but for Nintendo fans who may have only played the 4th game, this will feel like a major downgrade despite the HD visuals. Considering how similar this plays to the Visual Concepts remake of 1 and 2, and how Iron Galaxy seem to have been brought in at the relative last minute to make a quick guaranteed payout for Activision Blizzard, I'd say it's very likely that it's just using the existing engine from the first game, and they didn't have the time or budget to make a brand new engine that would have been required to fully do justice to the vastly more complex generational leap of the 4th game from 32/64 bits to 128. It's understandable, but to label this as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 feels like flat-out false advertising. It's more like 3 Deluxe. And considering many fans prefer 4 to 3, it's cynical to play off that brand recognition for 4 and nostalgia for something that you had no intention of even slightly trying to recreate. The other huge omission for those that love the originals, and just a major downgrade in general, even compared to the first remake in 2020, is the soundtrack. Now, the soundtracks were arguably a major reason the Tony Hawk's games were such a phenomenon the first times around. The developers knew that rock, ska, and punk music was a huge part of the skate scene and skate culture, and the X Games and MTV-style extreme sports coverage, so they went out of their way to have an incredible licensed soundtrack each time. Of course, it helped that they had access to Sony for the PlayStation versions, and Sony has a large music catalog. But part of the value in buying those games was it was like getting a free compilation CD of incredible music at a time when people actually paid for albums, and a compilation album by itself would have been maybe $20. So at least on the versions on optical disc, RIP the N64 versions. Press F to pay respects for anybody forced to play the games on cartridge. Also, it wasn't just the lack of music. The N64 versions seemed to have a lower frame rate, and there was the kind of typical problem of the graphics being a bit muddy. They were still good games, though. You know, if that's what you grew up with, I'm sure you had fun. Now, some of you will already be yelling at me, of course, in modern times, music licensing is very difficult and I shouldn't expect all of the original music to be here, present and correct. And trust me, you're preaching to the choir. As I said, I literally work in the film industry. I have negotiated film and TV rights for chart music in media, whether it's for the cinema, for TV, or whether it's for versions on DVD, Blu-ray, etc. Many times over the last 2.5 decades. And I'm well aware of how complicated, messy, and expensive that doing that can be. For example, I've had films where we've got the rights to use songs for the version shown in the cinema, but we couldn't negotiate for those same songs to be on the Blu-ray version, and we had to re-edit the entire film. I know it's complicated, and I didn't expect 100% of the original tracks to be here. That's not what I'm saying. But here's the thing. With the original Tony Hawk's 1 and 2 remake in 2020, Activision secured over 80% of the original tracks to return. They actually stated that they knew what an important factor these songs were to the nostalgia of playing the games, and they actively worked to get as many as possible. But in this game, less than 10% of the original tracks are here. AC/DC, NWA, Offspring, House of Pain, System of a Down, Chili Peppers, Goldfinger, and many more are noticeably missing. And Alien Ant Farm have even stated publicly that they weren't even asked. So it's likely that this was less a case of the rights being impossible to negotiate, but more of Activision Blizzard not wanting to pay, so not bothering other than a few key tracks like Ace of Spades for the title screen. So yeah, everything you loved is back, in inverted commas. That is definitely a lie, unless what you loved just happens to be the comparatively small amount of content that they chose to include and none of the large amount of content that they chose to remove. Sure, I can imagine a circumstance when all of a specific individual's favorite levels and music tracks just happen to be included, but that's very unlikely to be a high percentage of the people who buy this. Or by everything you loved is back, are they not even referring to the original games at all, but they would claim in court that they're just talking about the engine and gameplay mechanics of the 2020 remake brought back here with some additions? It's possible to argue that from a legal standpoint, I suppose, if you're trying to claim false advertising or something. But no, this is a retro-baiting nostalgia release. So it's not unreasonable to assume that for the majority of people, the quote implies that this is a faithful recreation of everything from the original games that it shares its name with, and that is simply not even slightly the case. The game costs $50, which might seem slightly cheaper than the average of $60 for those retro re-releases from third parties on Switch 2, but it's actually $70 for the digital deluxe version, which includes extra decks, creator skater items, 2 extra characters, including, weirdly, the Doom Slayer. Yes, the guy from Doom, WTF. I am a huge Doom fan, and I briefly mentioned in the last episode I'm very proud to have even had some really kind and lovely interactions with John Romero, a complete hero of mine who for some reason found out about my own games and sent me some support via Reddit that I will be forever grateful for and utterly baffled by. But This insertion of Doomslayer into Tony Hawk's doesn't feel like a cool novelty to me. It feels like a cynical fan milking from Activision Blizzard using a property they already own so they don't have to pay for, but they know will probably appeal to the same retro people they're trying to sell this compilation to. I'm not a fan. It also contains extra music in the digital deluxe version, and considering what a dog and pony show the soundtrack of the full game is, it feels almost insulting to make us pay for extra music when the vast majority of the music that we expected to be there isn't present. Again, only 10% of the original tracks. If you pre-ordered the deluxe version of the game digitally, you could also get it 3 days early, which also seems pretty cynical in order to try and avoid the potentially negative reviews and profit from all the goodwill of the much better original remakes of Tony Hawk's 1 and 2, which were much more faithful and contained nearly all of the full licensed soundtrack and all of the tracks. It's not unreasonable that people who bought and loved that first remake would just automatically assume that this second one would be of the same quality. This is what happens when a game is successful. There is a company merger, and the suits fire the original developers and try to put out a sequel at a lower cost to profit from the good reputation of the first. Hell, it's not like there will ever be a remake of Pro Skater 5 now, is it? Even Thug 1 and 2 seem unlikely, so they might as well make as big a profit as possible by cutting every cost you can, and screw the consumer. And speaking of cutting costs, if you want a physical version for the shelf, screw you too. It's not even a game card. It's a code in a box. Ew. And it doesn't even contain the DLC and deluxe content. Serves you right for wanting to collect physical games. And despite this being a title specifically aimed at the retro market who collect physical games. You don't even get the 32-bit, 64-bit retro-baiting wireframe mode pre-order bonus. Why would you? Why would you, as somebody who collects retro games? Why would you want that? If you do decide to buy, whether you decide to go for the code in a box or the digital download version, it will take up 38.2 gigabyte. So that's an effective extra $8.96 worth of storage space if you're buying the official Nintendo cards. Are we loving these new generation's tech innovations yet? So yeah, quick summary. Look, if you want a skateboarding game, this is your only option on Switch 2, but it is a good one. It plays just as well as this series ever did, and you will have a fun time, despite how annoyed I'm getting at all of this rubbish. If you only ever played Tony Hawk's 1 or 2, or either the originals or the remake, now I think about it, if you want a modern take on that, just with more of the same, this is a genuinely fantastic option. You'd probably arrive at around an 8 out of 10, or maybe even higher. But if you have specific nostalgia for Tony Hawk's 3 or especially 4, which many people, especially Nintendo fans, consider the best in the series, nah, this is going to disappoint you. It's still a good game and it plays well, but what with the high price tag, code in a box, huge amounts of missing content and downgrades, I can only really honestly give this a 6 out of 10. Which seems ridiculous, considering how nicely it plays for the content that's here. But let's call it 64%. Because like the N64 versions, it's still good and it still plays well, but it feels really lacking when compared to the better and cheaper ways to play the originals. If you like this review, or if you found any of this information useful, please leave a like, please leave a comment, consider subscribing and hitting the bell. And you can find ways to support the show and join our free members area where you can request future reviews, where you can give me feedback, ask me questions, and also you can take part in free, absolutely free competitions In order to win official Nintendo merchandise, you can find links at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. I hate putting out these reviews which have so much negativity. Let's hope that the forthcoming Donkey Kong Bananza review is going to be all positive. I am so hyped for that game and so looking forward to it, and I genuinely think it's going to be a banger. If that one disappoints me, I don't know what I'll do, but subscribe, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. Thanks, guys. Catch you later.